One of the classic literary examples of the foolishness of unnecessary arguments and fights and even wars occurs in Gulliver's Travels by Oliver Twist. In Gulliver's Travels, he comes across these miniature people. He washes up on shore, and Gulliver finds out that these Lilliputians are at perpetual war with their brethren over which end of the egg you are supposed to crack when making eggs. And of course, it's supposed to illustrate the folly of the wars in particular that were going on during his lifetime between the various European countries, the pettiness of it. One of my favorite examples of that is I forget which sitcom, I think it was in an episode of Cheers. They brought up the example, and then of course the people there started arguing about which end of the egg to crack because they didn't get the point at all, and that's what made it funny. Schisms and church splits and all of that happen over frivolous things, over things that are ridiculous and should not be the source of fights. Things that are important yet should not lead to this. Things like what Bible translation to use. NIV, King James, New Living, what one should we use? Sometimes churches, they can't get along anymore because they can't agree on that. Sometimes it's the music, old music, new music. Should we have a band? Should we use the organ? What kind of music? And people get upset and fight. Even from time to time, churches might get in fights over the decorations. The Christmas decorations, the color of the paint in the fellowship hall, that kind of thing. Whether or not they should replace the carpet, you would be surprised, but not really, over what kinds of petty things have wrecked churches. And of course, leadership disputes, right? When a pastor retires, or if they decide to fire one or bring in someone new, and other people don't like that decision, and they get upset about that decision, and then you've got a problem. Of course, churches fight over money, like families fight over money, because sometimes they have money and they fight over the money they have. Sometimes they don't have money and they fight over how to pay for the things they don't have money for. And of course, sometimes they fight over power, over who gets to be in charge of even the dumbest things that most people actually don't even care about. Those kinds of things are shameful. Those things are a stain upon the Church of Jesus Christ when it happens. And yet sometimes there are arguments and fights and divisions that happen over important things. During the 30 Years' War, the Catholic, Reformed, and Lutheran churches and the people that followed those causes were fighting over ideas about communion and baptism. What do these things mean? How do we implement them? How do they define who we are as Christians? Now, those are important issues. Those are things that it is important that we have a good understanding and a good theology about. Of course, the folly of that was that during the war, they were killing and torturing and raping and pillaging over those things, which of course is never acceptable. So are there issues worth, and we'll use the official word, excommunicating people over? Are there things that are so important as a church that if we can't see eye to eye on them, or if someone takes the other position, we need to say, sorry, go away? Well, that is the question John is addressing for us this morning in 2 John. How do we deal with these controversies and disputes? What should our attitude about them be? Let's dive into the text and see the particular issue that they were facing. John says, I say this because many deceivers who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh have gone out into the world. Any such person is the deceiver and the antichrist. That's the issue they were facing. He says, I say this. If you remember last week, we were talking about John saying, go back to the foundation, go back to the beginning and love one another. All right, he said, so I had to tell you that because you are facing this. You need to be grounded in the truth. You need to be unified together as a church because this threat exists from the outside. These people exist who are trying to do this, and he calls them antichrists. Now, we're all familiar with the individual termed that in John's Apocalypse, but here he's talking about people who deny Christ, people who work against the gospel, and he basically says anybody who is in that mold is an antichrist because they're working against what Jesus is trying to accomplish. In this case, John's opponents, the men that he knew, denied the full humanity of Jesus. It was a form of Gnosticism. It was popular in the first century. It came out of Greek philosophy. The idea basically that the Jesus that they saw was either some kind of phantom, right? It was an illusion. There was no real flesh there. He wasn't really a man. He was just spirit. That fit within the philosophical understanding of the day, and some people were buying it and embracing it. That's not really prevalent today. Nobody is walking around saying that about Jesus, that he wasn't really a man. What you find today, by and large, if somebody's going to deny what the scriptures say about Jesus, is that they're going to deny his deity. They might do it in the more classic sense, if you would, like the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons, who would define Jesus as a created being, as the highest of the created order, but not God himself. They're moving Jesus down a step below the Father. Or they might do it in the post-Enlightenment, postmodern sense that we deal with today, where things in the physical realm are real, but the spiritual is dismissed as being something that doesn't even exist. There is no soul, there is no afterlife, there is no God, and therefore, of course, Jesus was not God. That line of reasoning. Whether it's denying the humanity of Jesus or denying the deity of Jesus, it's the same thing. You're denying who he was. And so the question is, why is this important? Why was John upset about this? Why should we care about this? Well, very simply, our understanding of who Jesus is shapes our theology of what Jesus did and how that applies to us. If we don't understand who Jesus is, we won't understand what he did for us. And if we don't understand what he did for us, how can we apply that to our lives? Thus, it threatens what we call our soteriology. Soteriology is the fancy word for our theology about how we are saved. What is it about who Jesus was and what he did that saves us? We need a firm foundation in that theology, of course, because otherwise we go off in the wrong direction. John will talk about that in a minute. Now, there's, of course, other things. If people deny the humanity of Jesus or the deity of Jesus or his death and resurrection, etc., if they deny that, they're, of course, also denying the testimony of the apostles, and that's no small thing. They're denying the validity of the scriptures, and that's no small thing. But in this particular case, the end result is a version of Jesus that is not the same as the one taught by Paul and John and James and the rest. And John says any such person, anyone who follows that, because the details are going to change. There will be different specific objections with different rationales and different motives. But the parade of heretics and apostates will go on and be a threat in every generation. We know this because it's been this way for 2,000 years. It's not changed. Actually, some of the issues have changed very little from the day of the early church to now. They're framed differently and they're approached differently, but in the end, they're getting to the same place. Denying the humanity of Jesus or denying the deity of Jesus, and therefore denying the validity of what he did for us. Well, what does John have to say about such people? He says, watch out that you don't lose what we have worked for, but that you may be rewarded fully. You see, there is danger here to individual Christians, danger that they might be led to heresy and eventually apostasy. Let me define those, all right? Heresy is when you believe something which is against the Scriptures, something which is against what God has revealed. There are ones that are very consequential, and there are ones that are less consequential, but that's what heresy is. You can be a heretic and remain a Christian. You can have a bad belief about some part of your faith and have it not destroy the whole thing. An apostate is someone who walks away from their faith, whether because of their heresy becomes total or because they have chosen to do so, they say, no, I'm out. And there is a danger to individual Christians, and there is a danger to entire churches, and beyond that to whole denominations, that they might fall from the faith of the apostles, that they might fail in their mission to share the gospel and make disciples of Jesus Christ. If our theology, if our understanding of the Scriptures and the Word of God, in particular here, as we're talking about the person of Jesus Christ, if that becomes warped enough, we no longer function as a church. We no longer function as believers in Jesus Christ, and we fail. And John says, this is a danger and you need to be careful. He also says, is mentioning that it would be a shame to lose what they've already worked for. Have you ever stopped to think about this? There is a tremendous investment, if we can use that term, of time, energy, resources, and the lives of people that has been made so that we could be Christians. So that you and I could grow in the faith and come to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. A lot went into that. How many generations of faithful Christians did it take to bring the gospel to us in a form that was the same as that of the apostles? John is worried about the very first generation. That was a long time ago. How many generations of faithful people did it take? Writing and teaching and training people so that when we were born, the gospel existed in a way that still had the saving power that it had in the Apostle John's day. I don't have an exact number because we differ on how many years an exact generation is, but that's a lot. 2,000 years, that's a lot of generations of people. It's all over the Middle East and Europe and then to North America. All sorts of people contributed to us being here this morning and knowing Jesus Christ. But what if that chain were broken? What would happen to the next generation? What if, when the next generation came around, there was no one to share with them the gospel? There was no one to explain to them what it means, to show them what it is like to be a Christian, to demonstrate the Spirit working in their lives so that they could see it. Now we know that God will not be thwarted, and in the will of God cannot be gainsaid. We know that the Spirit of God can overcome our own stupidity and failures. But what a tragedy would it be to see that work, to see that investment become a dead end. It's a tragedy when it happens in a family, from one generation to the next, and then that generation, nobody follows the Lord, and the chain is broken. It's a tragedy when it happens in a local church. Church exists for 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, and then there comes a day when either the doors are closed because nobody is left, or what is preached there and what is taught there is no longer the gospel, and they would be better off with the doors closed because they're doing more harm than good. And it can happen into an entire denomination, to a whole group of churches where they have gone collectively so far astray that they're no longer rooted where they began. It is a tragedy when that happens on any level, and it happens all the time. Fortunately, of course, God is the one that sows seed, and sometimes that seed, though it might skip a generation, it could be reborn in the next. Or though a church might close, a new community might move in and use that same building and start a new church. Or though a denomination might split, the faithful remnant might continue on. You see, we are stewards of the blessings of God. We are obligated to nurture the gospel in our own lives, to bring ourselves with each other's help to maturity, and then to pass that on intact to tomorrow's church. And that is the key that John's talking about here. We must pass on something worth having. We must pass on something that still has saving power, or what else are we doing? Notice this warning: anyone who runs ahead and does not continue in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever continues in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. So what then happens to those who walk away from Jesus? What happens to those who abandon the faith of the apostles and the teaching of the Scriptures? John says, I'm sorry, but you lose the Father and the Spirit too. You can't reject Jesus and keep the rest. The Trinity is not a buffet where you can just have a little of one and a little of the other. You've got to have all or none. So if you reject who Jesus is and what he has done for us, then you've lost it. That is why, of course, we insist upon staying grounded in the teaching of Scriptures, why we insist upon being connected to the faith of our ancestors. The metaphor is being planted as a tree beside the living water, right? You've heard that one before. We have been put in a place of life. If we decide we would rather move, we would rather uproot this tree and go plant it somewhere else, we will no longer be nurtured by that living water. And we'll die a spiritual death. You see, we already have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We already have salvation by grace through faith. Why would we go somewhere else? Why would we walk away from here? This is the place of life. This is the place of vitality. This is the place of hope. And yet we know some have run ahead, as John says. I don't like that metaphor. Running on ahead, that's a good thing in most of my understanding as a runner. It's good when you run on ahead. It means you're pushing forward. But John is using it here, and I can see an analogy to that. Sometimes when you're out on the trails in the woods, if you don't know where you're going, but you leave the group because you want to go faster, when you come to an intersection, you go, well, I think right seems to be the way, or left. And you go that way, but when the group comes and they go the other way, suddenly being on ahead in the lead didn't do you so well. I remember a story, I can't help myself. When I was in middle school, my teammate, in one of her first middle school cross-country races, because she didn't know how to pace herself, ran out in the lead. And it was pretty impressive, except for she went the wrong way, and everybody followed her. Even the people from the school that we were at, their school, that should have known where the course went. And so the race directors were running around going, where do we send them now? They're just randomly running somewhere. There's like 50 middle school girls just running. I don't know, who knows how far they ended up running. They steered them toward a finish and said, okay. If you run on ahead, it only works if you're going the right direction. So here's an example of someone who ran ahead. You might have heard of him. Even though his name is pretty common, it's still quite famous. A man named Joseph Smith. Back in the 19th century, Joseph Smith said, you know what? Church needs reform. And he was absolutely right, because this was during the Second Great Awakening. The church was a mess, and God was working to correct it. But Joseph Smith said, I know the way out of this mess. And he abandoned the gospel, became an apostate, and led others astray. He became, as John describes it here, an antichrist. Someone who was leading people away from the genuine gospel. Unfortunately, he was successful, and millions of people over the years have followed him down that path. But the Jesus of Mormonism is not the Jesus of the apostles. He's not God. He's just a created being. And that is not sufficient. Well, what do we do then in response? John says, you stay put, others will go astray. Well, what do we do when they go astray? This is difficult but important teaching here. If anyone comes to you and doesn't bring this teaching, do not take them into your house or welcome them. Anyone who welcomes them shares in their wicked work. Now remember, this is the first century. There's not a network of churches. There's not a support system. When a teacher came, they welcomed them into their home. They provided lodging for them and food because they had no support. And so they had a very strong habit and a very good tradition of welcoming teachers who came from the outside. On behalf of Paul or on behalf of Peter or one of the other apostles, they would send people. And John says, if one of these people comes with this message, tell them no vacancy. You cannot stay here. We will not share our food with you. Not only was that against their practice, it was very much against their culture. So that's a big step. John is basically saying, treat them like they have an infectious disease. Don't get close enough to catch it. We don't want it to spread. Now, in our setting, in our day and age, this is not about free speech at all. It is not, and notice John does not tell them to shut them up. He says, don't you, by your effort, give them any help. Our ancestors in the faith didn't listen to John because when they ran into heretics and people that were apostates, they said, not only should we not host them, not only should we not help them, we're going to burn them at the stake. John didn't say that. Where did John say, kill them? He didn't say that. He said, shun them. Those are not the same thing, not even remotely the same. We know that they are actively working to destroy the gospel and ruin the church of God, so why would we let them use our resources to do it? That makes no sense at all. And that is all John is asking us to do, is draw a nice line and say, if that is the version of the gospel, if that is the Jesus that you're sharing, not here. And we're not going to allow you to use our resources, our facilities, our services, or whatever to do it. Now that sounds pretty radical, especially in a multicultural, postmodern world, to say that you're going to shut your doors, as it were, to somebody's idea. Now, we are not, again, talking about disagreements of interpretation. I read a verse and I think it means this. You read a verse and you think it means something different. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about personal conflicts, personality things. We're not talking about cultural differences. They worship this way in Africa and we do it here in America and it's different. We're not talking about that. We're talking about people who have radically, clearly defined unbelief. They are heretics about who Jesus is and what he did for us, and or apostates. It is active. It is aggressive promotion of false teaching aimed at the heart of Christianity, not periphery things, not things out on the fringes. This is Jesus Christ we're talking about. So no, this is not about whether or not we should just read the King James Bible. No, this is not about the culture war issues that we love to scream at each other on Facebook about. And it is absolutely not at all, I'll let that wait for a minute, about politics. If we're shunning people about that, then we're not listening to the Apostle John. If we're closing our doors to people over cultural things, we're not listening to the Apostle John. He is talking about heretics who are threatening the gospel. He says we need a serious response to a serious danger. If you allow this in your church, you are in danger. So take it seriously. Now, he doesn't talk about this, but the flip side is appropriate. If you apply that behavior to lesser things, less important things, less crucial things, then you're being ungracious and judgmental. See, the difficulty for some people is, where do we draw the line? Some people don't want to draw a line anywhere. There is nothing that you could say or believe that will make us disfellowship. That's wrong. There are other people who want the line to be a mile wide. And everything is a reason to not fellowship. Everything is a reason to say that person's not a true Christian. And they're wrong. John is saying there is a nice line, and here is where it is, and you need to respect it. We need to find the right stance in the midst of a list of important issues that we agree and disagree with people upon. There are important things that we disagree with people on that are not this. That's hard, is it not? That is difficult, especially in our culture, because our culture is moving into two competing camps. We've even given them colors to make it easier to remember who's who. We've got two camps, and we don't cross the line in between. John is not talking about this. John is talking about the heart and core of our Christian faith. And so I know sometimes people say, well, if we disagree about the translation, that's a slippery slope, and the next thing you know, we're disagreeing about Jesus. No. John's not talking about slippery slopes. Be aware that some ideas lead to other ideas, but disagreeing on one idea does not mean that someone is suddenly a heretic. And I know that sometimes people might say it's all a house of cards. If you don't agree with this one thing, then it all falls down, but that's not true. Because the foundation upon which our faith is built, has been built, is Jesus Christ. It is not a house of cards. It is not going to fall over with a slight breeze. What we are looking at here is clear and repeated heresy, denying who Jesus is and what he has done. That is the thing upon which we draw the line in the sand and say, no, we are on this side. If you are on that side, we're not in the church together. Now notice something else, and something I want to make sure that we understand in this. These are people that are claiming to be Christians that we're talking about, right? These are people that say, no, I'm a Christian, but they don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. We don't have any, how can we work together? Or these are people who believe, or who say that they are a Christian, but they say, well, this Bible's not from God, it's what men wrote. It's not really authoritative. How can we build together on that? But we are not talking about shunning and turning away non-believers. Not at all. Those are the people that we're supposed to be sharing the gospel with. We expect to disagree with them about who Jesus is, do we not? Because they don't believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, sent to save them from their sins. If they did, they'd be Christians like us. We expect not to agree on that. And so we don't get upset and say, well, I'm sorry, as a Hindu, you don't accept Jesus, or as a Muslim, you don't accept Jesus, so we can't talk to you. How dumb would that be? Those are the people we're supposed to be sharing the gospel with. And so let me give you the classic example, because this is one that you probably have had happen. What do you do when the Jehovah's Witness knocks on your door? What's your response supposed to be? Do you invite them into your home and have a conversation? Well, you've got two ways of looking at this. One way says these people claim to be Christians, but their Jesus is not our Jesus, and so we shouldn't talk to them. And the other to say these people need the gospel and somebody needs to explain it to them. So I would say if your faith is firm, if you understand who Jesus is, if you understand the scriptures and where that comes from, then say, come on in and you share with them. They came thinking they were going to share with you, but you turn the tables and say, hey, guess what? I know about Jesus too, and let me share with you. But if you are uninformed, if you don't understand the Scriptures, then no, don't listen to what they have to say because they might lead you astray. The same holds true for many such things. And so John is giving us this very important advice about how we act and interact with people who are sharing things and promoting things that are against the gospel. At the end, just a few brief things as he ends this very short letter. John says, I have much to write to you, but I don't want to use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to visit you and talk with you face to face so that our joy may be complete. I don't have much to say about that. I just am fascinated by someone talking about the joy of face-to-face conversation. It's weird. He didn't want to write by letter. He wanted to talk to them face to face. In a generation, people are going to read that and just be totally confused. Right? What does that mean? Why would anyone want to talk to someone face to face? Weird. John's old school, by the way, back in the day. And then lastly this. The children of your sister who is chosen by God send their greetings. And that is just a reminder to us of where John started this letter, talking about the family bond, about the bond that is in Jesus Christ, the bond of the people of God who are brought together because of the love of God for them. So what do we take from this second half? The first half of John telling us about our need for love and truth. The second half, some hard stuff, but important things. Number one, to deny Jesus is to be an antichrist. That's all there is to it. You don't have to be evil. You don't have to have bad motives. If you deny Jesus Christ, it makes you an antichrist. That's just the definition. Secondly, we must remain true to our foundation in Christ. This is not negotiable. This is not optional. The generations of people in the faith gave us this blessing, and we must give it to the next generation. And then lastly, anybody can come here and hear the gospel. Anybody walks through that door on Sunday that is willing to sit and listen to the gospel, I will preach to them, and you will welcome them, and we will be glad they are here. And that is absolutely true. I don't care what they look like. I don't care where they came from. We've had some unique visitors. Remember when the gentleman from India, from the subcontinent of India, came here because they were working at the Joy. They all came in one Sunday morning. We didn't expect to see them. But they were here and they worshiped with us, and that was awesome. They were Christians from India. There are a good number of them there. All are here, welcome to hear the gospel here. But nobody is allowed to work against the gospel and be a part of this church. That's not about whether we love you. It's not about whether we like you. If your intent is to work against the gospel of Jesus Christ, then we can't have you here, because that is not our mission and that is not our purpose.